Chapter 4 of Lord Latimer's Ladies by Margaret E. Lynn Schmidt and Dan McLaughlin, and read by Dan McLaughlin. Brian versus the Buttons. The valet had grown pale, and in his widening eyes Brian sensed that the man's air of effortless competence was taking a considerable hit in the face of an actual life or death situation. By dead, you mean what, precisely, sir? He asked. I mean dead, said Brian, as a doornail, pushing up the daisies, no longer alive. He waved his hand vaguely in the air to signify a list that could go on and on. I mean, if I truly arrived with no clothes at all, what did you think this thing was attached to my body for? Brian held out his insulin pump. And what did you think these were? Pointing to the sensor and the patch with a tube on it. Well, they were with you when you were delivered, the valet said, looking unusually meek. Thanks a ton for not whisking them away, said Brian, only a little sardonically. I'm impressed by your restraint. We didn't realize they had come from your time, confessed the valet. Our guess was that they had something to do with whatever quest you would be given, so none of us thought it wise to interfere. Brian moved to stand by the window, with its curtains billowing in the cold, clean, pre-industrial 1800s air. He let out a sigh. All right, here we go. This is Pump 101, info for interested strangers version. The valet returned a blank look, and Brian summoned up what few scraps of patience he had left. He reached under his nightshirt and held out the box that never left his side. It was fairly nondescript, smooth, and gray, and small enough to hold in the palm of his hand. This device is my insulin pump. It measures my blood sugar levels and then gives me enough insulin to make them what they should be. Insulin? Echoed the valet. Brian waved his hand again, shooing away tedious medical or chemical explanations. Without it, I die pretty quick. And this small device delivers the insulin through this tubing here? The valet indicated the cannula, the flexible plastic tubing that connected the pump to a discrete padded port on Brian's abdomen. He seemed impressed by the technology, and also seemed to be paying attention. Brian hoped it was not just his professional facade. Around them, the castle settled and groaned. The science behind this is marvelous, said the valet. For you, maybe, Brian said. You've got one of these already inside of you. It's called a pancreas. Unfortunately, my pancreas doesn't do its job all that well. In fact, it's just a freeloader these days, producing no insulin. So in its place, I got the mechanical model. With a flamboyant gesture, Brian held the pump out for inspection, and the valet obediently adjusted the spectacles he wore and took a closer look. So, the valet ventured, the pump itself only serves to deliver the liquid, this insulin that you need to live. He seemed to be following along quite nicely. I note there is already some liquid within these tubes. Careful not to touch anything, the valet pointed at the pump. And there seems to be some sort of display at the front. Are you able to ascertain how much insulin you currently have upon your person and how quickly you use it? Gratified by the intelligent and relevant questions that suggested the valet was taking the subject seriously, Brian consulted his pump. When fully loaded, this thing can hold 300 units. After the party last night, I have about 200 units left. The basic rate is 1 unit an hour. But that's good news, the valet was obviously relieved. 200 hours is about 8 days. Though he appreciated the valet's on-the-fly math skills, Brian held up a hand to squash any premature celebration. But see, that's only if I don't eat. It takes extra units to digest my food. A meal can be anywhere from 15 to 25 units. Basically, I go through 75 to 100 units a day. So what I have here is more like a 2 or 3 day supply. I note there's a range of costs for your meals, the valet ventured. Well, it depends on how much sugars or carbs are in the meal, Brian said. Do you guys even have carbs these days? So the goal is to keep your blood sugar down. The valet wisely resisted the urge to switch conversational tracks along with Brian. And a low intake of sugary foods can buy you some additional time. Are there other methods you could use to keep your blood sugar down? As the discussion turned to more practical solutions, Brian began to feel more optimistic. There's exercise, he said. The valet nodded, and Brian continued. That seems to make my body run more efficient. Ah, said the valet, and gave a little bow, his professional demeanor restored. In that, I believe I can be of some assistance. The estate is large, with many well-tended paths suitable for brisk walks. Allow me to assist you in changing from your nightclothes to something more suitable for taking exercise. And so saying, he turned to the closet and began removing an impressive amount of clothing, items he clearly felt would be needed for Brian's impending outing. In light of all the strangeness of the last half hour, it seemed silly to feel self-conscious about having someone else help dress him, especially considering the man had apparently been in charge of giving him the dress, no nightshirt in the first place, but Brian's emotions didn't seem to be on board with that realization. He could feel himself wanting to blush, and he had to fight the sensation. Brian narrowed his eyes at the valet. By the way, you got a name? Reginald Shield, supplied the valet. Reginald. Reginald. Brian said it several ways, like a sommelier swishing a new wine in his mouth. Traditionally, I am called Reginald, began the valet. Never been good with names, my friend, Brian confessed, interrupted without much remorse. Doesn't matter, he said, trying another lordly wave. Point is, I'm not going to sit in this room and wallow over the imminence of my demise. No, I want to go out. I'm going out, but not in this dress. So, what do I get to wear? Reginald Shield, showing true mastery of his craft, divined the actual question that pertained to him and presented an outfit for Brian's approval. I think this shall suffice quite well for your walking dress, my lord, he said. Definitely not a dress, Brian protested. The valet turned in surprise, and then understanding dawned, lightening the severe lines on his face and making him look much younger. It's only an expression, Reginald said reassuringly. It means a combination of clothing in which you will outfit yourself for the activity in question. As a lord of the castle, you would wear a walking dress to go walking, or a riding dress if you chose to ride a horse, or a full dress if you were to attend a formal ball. Just an outfit, said Brian with dark suspicion. Yes, sir. Not a dress, said Brian. No, sir, said the valet. All right then, my good fellow, you may proceed. Brian tried on the sound and affectations he felt were appropriate for the lord of the manor. For a first attempt, it was a first attempt. The languid waving of his hand did not noticeably make things better. With the same level of care as one might use to tend to a poorly arranged pile of explosives, Reginald stepped forward and divested him of the nightshirt, and immediately replaced it with a different shirt, one which seemed fancier, but not noticeably shorter. "Wait a minute," said Brian. "If you would be so good as to put your arms out to the side, my lord," Reginald said. "I will just attend to the buttons at the collar and wrist." There seemed to be a number of them. "Hold still, please." Brian felt very much like he had at 10 years old, when his mother had taken him to the department store and made him try on his new school clothes. Through an extreme effort of will, he managed to stand still while this Reg dealt with the several dozen ties, buttons, and ribbons, which, as a whole, consisted of the various ways that men's garments stayed up in the PE, or pre-elastic era. Then there was the necktie, which was not like any tie Brian would have ever worn in the 21st century, if he had ever been the sort to go in for ties at all, which he wasn't. All at once, he had a sudden thought. "Reg?" "Yes, my lord. If you could just turn a bit here." "Thank you, sir. You were saying?" "Now you are dressing me." "Indeed, my lord. Well spotted." The valet was engrossed in his task, and Brian was 87% certain the man hadn't meant to be audibly sarcastic. An outside observer would have thought that number generous. "But I can't help but notice that you are dressed much like myself." "Not precisely, my lord. Evidently, a professional valet could be pedantic and fasten buttons at the same time." Not to be deterred, Brian, who was adapting rather quickly to letting someone else fuss with his clothes, persisted in a thoughtful tone. "But I mean the basic design of the garments is basically the same, yes?" "Yes, my lord." "Well then, who dresses you?" He delivered the line in a gotcha tone of voice, as if his mind was looking to impose some kind of sense in his new surroundings. "I'm not quite following, my lord." The lacing up continued, uninterrupted by the philosophical discourse flowing around the activity. With a rising tone, Brian said, "I mean, if everyone is wearing basically the same thing and has to hold still while someone laces them up, that includes you." "Yes." "Other side, my lord." "Well done. Pray continue." Reginald seemed rather more focused on pulling a cord through a complex pattern of eyelets than on Brian's conversation, but as lord of the manor, Brian decided not to let it slow him down. "Then it follows," Brian continued, "someone had to dress you, and someone had to dress him, and so on, moving backward." "Hold still, my lord." Reginald continued to demonstrate multitasking years before the invention of the expression. "Tricky part here." "Ah, well done. Please, go on." "So, chicken and the egg time. Who came first, the dresser or the dressee?" Brian's question typically was presented in the form of a joke. Reginald paused from where he was currently engaged in buttons somewhere around Brian's knees. Deadpan, he said, "It's possible some of us are more adept at self-buttoning, sir." "Ah, that makes sense," Brian said in a reflective tone, and tried another lordly wave of his hand. His new shirt sleeves had lace edges on them, and this, he realized, made all the difference in a grand gesture. "Take your time, Reg. Take your time." He waved his hand again and liked the effect. "No need to hurry. I have 3 whole days before I'm dead." Brian's tone was dry. Reginald's matched it. "Yes, my lord. Can't imagine what I would like to do with my remaining 36 hours more than standing here with you tugging at various parts of my person." "Sarcasm noted, my lord," said Reginald. "Well done, you. But I hope you will find it to have been worth your weight." Gently, the valet gave Brian a quarter turn so that he could see himself in the full-length mirror. "Only an instant while I fetch your coat," he said, but Brian had, for the moment, forgotten to be impatient. He stood, staring at his reflection, hardly able to believe he was looking at himself. Different, yes. The clothes were definitely something from another time, but in them Brian couldn't help but feel he was standing up a little straighter, and he seemed to carry himself with, maybe, elegance? Alice had been going on forever about wanting him to spruce up his wardrobe, but he'd never felt the need for anything better than a t-shirt, jeans, and his trusty baseball cap. Was it possible that he could have been missing out all these years? No, the last thing he needed right now was to tell his sister that she'd been right all along. That's what Brian thought anyway, until his valet carefully helped him into his coat. The coat was amazing. Brian loved the button-fly breeches and the button vest. He especially loved the lacy shirt sleeves, 3 buttons each at the wrist, and the way they made his gestures more theatrical. But the coat, well, the coat was dark wool and long, with a little cape that made his shoulders look broader. The whole thing went down to his knees, and Brian said, "What an awesome coat!" and meant it. "It looks like something out of a play. Great pick, Reg. How did you know I've always wanted one of these?" "It's a great coat, my lord," said Reginald. "Damn straight," Brian said. "It's a really great coat." He dashed over to the corner, picked up a broom, and then with a dramatic leap jumped up on the bed. Waving the broom handle like a banner from side to side, he began, to the valet's horrified surprise, to sing at the top of his lungs. "One day more, dum-dee-dum, one day more, and la-dee-da, one day more." He paused. He looked over at Reginald, but the valet didn't seem to realize when applause was due. "No? Nothing? Nada?" Brian said. "Maybe something not so close to home." Brian tossed the broom aside. "How about this hit from the colonies?" Pulling the cape across his face like Snidely Whiplash or Count Dracula, Brian advanced on Reginald. "Wah-ha-ha," he snarled in a much deeper voice. "Simple Nell, you must pay the rent." From Reginald's expression, this sort of behavior had not been covered in any chapters of the valet handbook, inferring inaccurately that the deer in the headlights expression on Reginald's face meant his performance was being well received. Brian struck another pose, fluttered his eyelashes, and rested his wrist against his forehead. His voice went from baritone to a screeching soprano. "Oh, spare me, Mr. Whiplash! I can't pay the rent." Brian assumed his villainous character again, raised his hand to point at the ceiling, and took a step forward. "You must pay the rent." Reflexively, the valet took a step back. "But I can't pay the rent." Brian's falsetto echoed through the castle, and so did the echo of his boots as he stomped to and fro, committing melodramaticide with a malice aforethought. "You must pay the rent," bounced off the walls. "But I can't pay the rent," reverberated through the air. Playing air trumpet to create his own fanfare, Brian took a bold step to the side, placed his hands on his hips, and thrust out his chest in a heroic manner. "Ee-ee-ee! I'll pay the rent," Brian the hero intoned. "My hero!" trilled Brian as Nell, and "Curses! Foiled again!" he thundered as the vile villain. Brian paused, the echoes of his performance dying around him, but no applause was forthcoming. Reg seemed to have been momentarily stunned by the impromptu flurry of theatrics. "No? Needs railroad tracks? Something?" Brian looked to his uncomprehending audience of one, and was just a little pleased to have gotten a little bit of harmless revenge after a morning of feeling ignorant and out of his depth. He missed his sister. If she had been present, Alice would definitely have had something to say about this performance. Brian decided to take pity on the valet, who possibly needed to recover from a lecture on diabetes and a stirring rendition of classic melodrama within the same half hour. Brian smiled at the valet and took a bow. "Thanks for everything, Reg," he said. "You know, I think I'm going to take a walk now." "Your walking stick, my lord." Reginald managed to pull himself out of his shocked silence just enough to supply Brian with this elegant object. Brian took it and admired the overall effect in a mirror. "Looking good," he told his reflection, and with a swirl of his caped greatcoat exited the room.